after losing my voice, I haven't built up the scar tissue again yet. All right, let us finish up by going over utilitarianism and Kant's deontology. So, I've done these in terms of just some simple questions and then how you answer those questions, and that's what we're going to do now. So, with utilitarianism, we said it's a version of consequentialism, which is a moral theory that determines what's right and wrong in terms of consequentialism is a theory that determines the right and wrong in terms of the consequences. There we go. Yeah, consequences. And so the question with utilitarianism is how do you measure the consequences? And this is actually something Glebach answered before. So what's the answer of how do you measure the consequences? Pleasure versus pain. Pleasure versus pain. So, if it causes pleasure, that's a tick in its favor. If it causes pain, that's a tick against it. And the more pleasure something causes, the better it is morally. And the more pain something causes, the worse it is morally. So what's a question that might come up at this point? We say, the most pleasure or most pain?
For who?
Exactly. So, for who, I don't care about the who-whom distinction, it's dumb. For who? So, you might say the right thing to do is the one that causes the most pleasure. And you go, for who? Because here's a moral theory. The thing that's the right thing to do is the one that causes the most pleasure to Donald Trump. Yeah. It doesn't feel like that's the right thing. So whatever it is, like, you know, if Trump likes it, this is why on this theory, Twitter's the greatest thing ever invented because it causes Donald the most pleasure. But that's not a good theory. So the question is, for who? And what's the utilitarian answer?
The most pleasure for the most people.
Yeah, so it's just the most overall. It's the most pleasure universally. So it's, one way of putting it is most pleasure for most people. Another way is just the most overall. So, on a utilitarian view, if it makes Donald happy, but it makes, you know, 150 million people very sad, then it's the wrong thing, because Donald's happiness does not outweigh the however many people who are made sad by it. And so on this view, what makes something right or wrong is just a mathematical calculation. You find out what makes something right, you just look at, well, how much pain is it going to cause and how much pleasure it's going to cause. And if it causes a lot of pleasure for the world, the most people as a whole, that's a good thing. And if it causes a lot of pain, it's a bad thing. And if you're going between two choices, like, you know, press the button and have it run over one person, or don't press the button, have it run over 5, what's the utilitarian going to say? Or how would a utilitarian go about answering this question?
You kill the one.
You would kill the one, and you kill the one because, you know, one person dying is less overall pain in the world than 5 people dying. But it also, another nice thing, it also explains some of our other versions. So if we said, imagine the 5 people are those serial murder rapists, you could say, well, the reason why in that case you shouldn't press the button is because if you let those people continue to live, they are probably going to go out and serial murder rape more, and then the overall amount of pleasure in the world would be worse. Because the issue is that, you know, while their lives would be would cause more pleasure to them staying alive, in the long run, more people in the world will be less happy by keeping them around than if that one person was there. Or it also explains why if you had like 100 people on the tracks, but the one person there was the doctor who's about to cure cancer, it seems like you saved that one doctor. And why? Because that one doctor has the power to bring a lot more pleasure and keep a lot less pain, or keep more pain out of the world, allow less pain in. So does everyone understand how that's supposed to go? Any questions at this point? Questions, comments, concerns? All right, so that's basically what utilitarianism is. It's real simple, or at least this version of it. This is what we call act utilitarianism, and it's just the way you decide what's right or wrong is you look at each individual act you're about to perform, and you ask yourself, what's the correct action to perform in this moment, or what's the correct act to do right now? So, it would be the sort of thing like, I promised my grandmother that I would come to tea with her, but I also really want to go to the movies with my new significant other, and I really want to spend time and we'll have a really good time together. And the way you decide is, how would a utilitarian decide whether you go to the movies with your partner or you just go and see grandma? How would they decide which the right? Here's an ordinary everyday situation, which according to a utilitarian, there's going to be a right answer about whether you should go to the movies with your boyfriend, girlfriend, significant other friend, or go and visit grandma. How do you decide? For a utilitarian. What would you have to calculate?
Pleasure versus pain.
Yeah, it's pleasure and pain. You just find out who would be happier. If you two go to the movies, will that amount of happiness of seeing the movie offset the sadness that grandma would feel? And the sorts of things you'd have to consider are like, would grandma, like, if grandma would be real sad, then you gotta go see grandma. But if your partner, if you don't go to this movie, this person's gonna break up with you and then you're gonna be heartbroken and really sad and yada yada, and that's gonna be more than you go to the movie. And that's all it's a matter of. And everything in your life, that's how you decide it.
But what if you don't go to the movie, what if you don't go see your grandma and she dies?
Yeah, so here's another case. Is like, you're gonna have to calculate the odds that grandma dies. And if the odds of if it's like grandma's in the hospital and you know like this could be the last time and you know you're gonna regret it for the rest of your life, and her last dying thoughts are like, God damn my grandchild. Like, you probably should go see her. So that's the general idea though, is you just measure it. So, how many people feel at least the first intuitive pull of like, this seems like a decent way of getting around with some moral theories? I definitely, like, in certain situations it seems to work really well, and it seems to be something like I actually use. And it seems to be something like when you're deciding where to go to dinner, you take it into account. It's like, oh, my family is coming this weekend, and my extended family, and I want to take them out to dinner. And which restaurant is the right restaurant to choose? Well, my dad hates spicy food, so let's not get Mexican food. Like, problem solved. And by spicy food, I mean my father can't eat black pepper without getting like a welt inside of his mouth. So it really limits our options here. But yeah, that's the sort of thing. And like, if I somehow choose a restaurant that my dad will hate and will literally cause his mouth to burn, I've done something wrong. And this looks like utilitarianism gives us the right answer. Now, what are some issues though with this way? Because at the end of the day, neither of these is perfect, and both of them have some pretty big problems. So this sort of utilitarianism is you just look at an action, decide what's the right thing to do. What are some issues with it, like some major ones?
If you consider like utilitarianism in another thought experiment, it's like if you're stranded in like an island and you're deciding like you need to kill one person for the other 3 people to live, then like utilitarianism, it's pretty easy to be like, okay, kill that one person so 3 people could live. But the problem is that theory doesn't morally give you a way to choose the person that you're going to kill.
Yeah, so here's one thing. So you've actually touched on like 3 different issues here. One of them is utilitarianism. It doesn't tell you what to do if the answer, like each action is exactly equal. Like if you have 3 people, one of them has to die to feed the other 2. But imagine it's like 3 identical triplets. Like they all feel just as close to each other. They all are relatively biologically the same. They all are like the same height, same weight. So it's not like one person is going to feed the other 2 for a lot longer or anything like that. Or it's not. It's literally like there isn't a right way to make this decision. And what do you do? Like it's like we get to this point, utilitarianism's like, well, I don't know what to do here. Like we're kind of screwed because we can't make a decision because there's not a right decision. And so it's like sometimes utilitarianism won't give an answer. But there can be another issue which is related to this. It seems like sometimes the answer it gives you is something that's wrong. Like it seems like there can be times in which what act utilitarianism says you should do is not really something which any rational, normal individual would say would be a thing which should be allowed. So does anyone, either from the textbook or can think off the top of their head, about something where, like, you'd suggest it to an average person, they'd be like, that is terribly morally, like, terrible, we should not allow that, that is not something which should be allowed in our society, and yet a utilitarian would have to go, yeah, we can do that around here. Does anyone have anything they can think of? Alright, here's a classic example. So imagine it's like the Old West, with cowboys and all that sort of stuff. And there's a bandit on the loose, and everyone is terrified of the bandit. And the bandit's been, raping and murdering and stealing everyone's money. And you as the sheriff, this, random person comes into town, and, nobody knows them. They don't know their story, and you arrest this person, and you say, "You're the bandit, we're hanging you." You have absolutely no evidence that this is the bandit. In fact, the bandit, has blue eyes, and this person has brown eyes. But nobody else knows that. But you know that if you hang this person, the population is going to be like, yeah, now we don't feel scared anymore. So you decide, you know what, string them up, hang them. And you do. How many people think this is the right thing to do in this situation? You should just take this totally innocent person and hang them. It seems like most people want to say, no, you should not do this. And yet a utilitarian in a certain type of situation is going to have to say, like, yeah, that's the right thing to do because the amount of pleasure overall will offset the pain.
I think that it's not right, not because he's like innocent or whatever, because the bigger problem is that he would be lying to the people, and he would be like, okay, you guys are safe, and then the real bandit would come through and like fuck everybody shit. Here's the utilitarian case. So this is exactly the sort of thing I want you all to be doing, which is I make a point and then you make a good counterpoint. And this is an excellent point. What a utilitarian can say here is to say, no, you're simplifying the case. The fact is that by hanging the wrong person, now everyone's less safe than they were, and the consequences are actually worse. But let's change the case up a little bit and come up with one in which you say, like, no, the consequences aren't worse. Like, we can imagine that you're the sheriff, and no, let's go with a slightly different case. There's a terrorist who has a nuke in New York City, and they say they are going to bomb New York City. They're going to detonate the nuclear weapon unless you start a this is.
Oh, I was thinking about George W. Bush, like the events after the 9/11, like how he approached with this situation and how he used utilitarianism.
Yeah. But let's go with a crazier one that's a lot easier to wrap our heads around. Imagine the terrorist says, unless you start up a YouTube stream and skin a baby alive on this YouTube screen, we're detonating the bomb.
I definitely want to do that.
Or say it's the sort of thing where it's not just say it's not a nuke in New York City. Let's say something simple of he's got a gun to the head of like he's got 10 hostages and says, I will kill these 10 hostages if you don't skin this baby alive on a YouTube channel. What's the utilitarian going to say the right thing to do is? Skin the baby.
I never thought I'd.
Yeah. A utilitarian is going to say that the right thing, because babies are not super well developed, it probably can't even feel as much pain as like an adult could.
Okay, hang on.
That's what a utilitarian's going to go. To be clear, I'm not a utilitarian. Let's just make this clear. I'm anti-baby skinning. But like these are the sorts of things which a utilitarian is going to have to say. They're going to have to say, skin the baby alive. The amount of pleasure that is being caused to the world by those 10 people living is better. And yet, very few people want to be like, I'm not sure the right thing to do here is skin a baby alive. Like I definitely, when your moral theory says skin the baby, like something's gone wrong. So that's an issue with utilitarianism, and this is what is often called the justice objection, because it seems like if you're going on like a sense of mathematical right and wrong, what often happens is that what you do is you end up like doing unjust things, like things which utilitarianism says is the right thing to do, but to your everyday mind, you're like, you shouldn't kill innocent people for the greater good. Like, you shouldn't skin babies alive for the greater good. Like, as soon as you're doing things for you shouldn't bomb a hospital for the greater good. Like, these was like, this argument, the utilitarian argument, was exactly the argument that was used by politicians in World War II before the atomic bomb was dropped. It was the number of people in the long run will be saved, and the war will end sooner if we drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that's the line of reasoning. But there's still a sense of like, no, when your answer is drop an atomic bomb, something's gone wrong. And
So that's the response. Now, a utilitarian might not accept this and just be like, yeah, you gotta accept that. But this is the idea of the justice objection.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's like totally validity in like the long run, but something that strikes me is that there's like the long run, but you're doing stuff in the present, like you're hurting people in the present.
So this is another issue we're going to come to, which is actually, so I'm going to come back to that point in about 5 minutes because it's an excellent one and will help me highlight another issue that I think there is with utilitarianism. But the first thing is, utilitarians have come along and responded to these justice-style objections by developing a slightly different form of their view. So act utilitarianism says the right thing to do is you look at this moment in time and you decide what is the correct action to do. But there's another type of utilitarianism called, I don't know how much of this is on the screen, so we're just going to hope, rule. You hear that, future people? Rule, like R-U-L-E, rule utilitarianism. And what a rule utilitarianist says is that you don't decide on a case-by-case basis. Rather, you think about society as the whole, and you just come up with a bunch of general rules, which in the long run will cause more overall pleasure and more overall pain. So you imagine like designing a society, and you come up with a whole bunch of rules for that society. They're designed to make the society a place that has a lot of pleasure and a small amount of pain. So in this sort of society, you'd be like, all right, let's imagine we have a society. Here are two different sets of rules. One, murder is allowed. The other, murder's not allowed. And then you ask yourself, well, which society would have more pleasure in it? Which ones would have more pleasure?
No murder.
No murder, because nobody's going to be getting murdered, so therefore you say it's wrong to murder. All right, now we move on to things like charge people you know to be innocent for the greater good. And you think, well, a society that does this and allows it, in the long run, will be less happy than a society that doesn't allow it, because in the long run, you will have actual criminals escaping trial. You will have people afraid for their lives just because they happen to live in a certain neighborhood where there's certain types of profiling. You will have AIDS. So the idea is you're supposed to say, no, don't look at an each case-by-case basis. Think big picture of, is this sort of rule something which everyone could follow? And it could be a general rule for the whole population. If so, then it's okay. And so you don't have to worry about your situation in this moment. You instead look bigger picture. So that's what rule utilitarianism is. So that's designed to solve this particular issue. But there are still others that come up. And, I'm sorry, remind me of your name.
Christina.
Christina. Well, Christina's point is there's something very strange about, like, so everyone on board with the way this is going. We've come along, we've come up with utilitarianism, we've answered these questions. How do you measure pleasure and pain for who? Everyone. And then there's this thing of an act utilitarian says you decide on a case-by-case basis. Like, right now, what should I do? Well, I decide based on the consequence of my particular action. But one issue with that is sometimes it's going to tell you to like do horrible things like skin babies, shoot people for the greater good. So another version of utilitarianism might come along and say, all right, pleasure, pain, that's still the right way to measure it, but we need to take a bigger picture and come up with just general societal rules. And right and wrong is defined in terms of those general rules, not your particular situation here and now. But there's still going to be problems, and that's what rule utilitarianism is. Rule utilitarianism, as in you design rules for the society to follow. The issue with this, though, some of the issues, well, one of them is, Christina, can you say your point again?
I don't know, what I was thinking is like, there's no way to ensure that like you hurting this amount of people will like technically like ensure that in the future.
Here's the major issue. Utilitarianism, one thing it's assuming is that you know what the consequences are when you make that action. And here's something, how many of you can predict the future perfectly? Yeah, good. You're actually that would have. I guess I should have tested awake and asleepness by saying, raise your hand if you can't predict the future perfectly. Okay, so we have a few psychics in here. That's good. All right, so that's a useful skill to have, and you'll do really well on the test. No, but the issue is utilitarianism is assuming that in this moment you know what's going to happen. But imagine what comes along is you're skinning that baby alive, and all of a sudden the terrorist, they get so excited they have a heart attack. Like, or maybe they were just going to have a heart attack anyway. And now you're like, well, now I skinned this baby for nothing. Because this guy was just gonna fall over anyway. So like now all of a sudden what you did was wrong because you should have known that the terrorist was gonna have a heart attack. It's like, so you went from a moment of that being the right thing to do to actually, no, surprise, it was the wrong thing because your action didn't make any difference because they were gonna die anyway. Or another issue is like, what downstream effects are you responsible for? Like, if you help a little old lady across the street, consequentialism, you measure in terms of the consequences. Utilitarianism, at first glance, you might think, oh, yeah, the right thing to do here, in either form, act or rule, you know, you follow the rules, generally rules that say things like, don't hurt people or don't murder are going to lead to generally better consequences. But say then, you know, the zombie apocalypse comes along and all of a sudden you're the person walking around being all like, I don't hurt other people. I don't fight. Then all of a sudden, like, because the world has changed, it now seems like you're just going to end up being someone's dinner. And it seems like if the situation changes enough, then all these lovely rules we came up with, because the future we cannot predict, it's really hard even for a rule utilitarian to know, like, which rules are the good ones in the long run. It's even clearer with act utilitarianism. If you help a little old lady across the street, and therefore crossing the next street, she gets there, instead of just like giving up and not going to the store. Crossing the street, she gets hit by a car. The car causes a mother to turn because she hears the loud crash. Her baby ends up rolling down the street. The baby gets its leg run over. It ends up being bitter. And because of that, it spends its whole life torturing small animals and eventually becomes a serial killer. Now is it the case that you helping this little old lady across the street was the wrong thing to do? And it seems like you cannot predict the future. It seems like for utilitarianism to really be useful, you need to be able to predict what's going to happen in the future and decide how on earth things are going to come out, and we cannot do that. One thing you might say in response to that is, well, you know, you don't have to